Hey everyone, Hellhog here, or you may know me as Aeyix on the Shadowlands. I want to make an updated version of my 3.0 Deception Assassin Guide. This time, I'm also making a Republic side version. If you'd like the Infiltration Shadow version of this guide, you can find that, as well as a Hatred, Serenity, Mercenary, and Commando guides in the description below or on my YouTube channel. This guide will focus on the PvE side of Deception Assassin, and is broken up into 6 parts. Timestamps to the separate parts can be found in the description below if you'd like to skip ahead. 6 parts are Deception's purpose and usefulness in flashpoints and operations, a gearing overview, utilities overview, abilities overview, the rotation, and finally an example dummy parse. Let's get started. Overall, Deception in operations and flashpoints is lackluster since its nerf back in 4.0.3. It sits in the bottom tier of disciplines for single target damage, even losing to Hatred, making Hatred the more favorable choice for sustained encounters. If you need area of effect damage, although Deception does have bonuses to lacerate, Hatred's rotation having built-in AoE as well as dot spreading makes it the superior choice for fights where AoE damage is needed. Where Deception does shine over Hatred though is its burst and survivability. Its burst is around middle of the pack, relying on timing up Recklessness and Phantom Strike to really pump out some quick damage, otherwise it tapers off quite quickly. The survivability of Deception is some of the best in the game though. For example, on hard mode Sword Squadron, I often average 1000 damage taken per second less than I do Hatred. This class has at its disposal 30% AoE damage reduction as well as a stacking damage reduction up to an additional 9%, as long as you don't have to stop DPSing for more than 15 seconds. Combined with the utility insulation being taken, this gives Deception the equivalent of heavy armor. Add in your rotational use of Blackout and Force Cloak, and you should have about 30% uptime on Dark Embrace, which further reduces damage another 25%. At that point, you're basically a tank. The downside though is the rotational use of Blackout, Force Cloak, and Phantom Strike. Powerful cooldowns, raid utility, and a gap closer that all can have their value at certain times in specific fights. However, holding off on them also leads to significantly lower potential DPS. The other annoyance to DPS is the positional requirement of Maul. In some cases, you may not always be able to attack from a position that allows use of the move, which unfortunately leads to more DPS loss due to it being Deception's hardest hitting ability and important to force management. Even with all of Deception's annoyances, it's still a very fun discipline to play and perfectly viable choice for flashpoints and hard mode operations. Its viability in nightmare operations, however, varies significantly based on the boss and your group composition. In many cases, you may be better off playing Hatred or asked to play a different class for the hardest of content. Before you go any further with this guide, if you haven't done so yet, I highly recommend you go through and read all the tooltips and descriptions in your discipline and abilities pane so that you are familiar with the class, its buffs, abilities, and cooldowns. Now let's discuss gearing. For those watching from my shadow guides, don't be alarmed that I'm on an assassin. Gearing for assassins and shadows is exactly the same, and for the ease of simplicity and be able to show what I want, I'm on my assassin since it's better geared. If you're looking for further theory crafting and discussion on gearing, I highly recommend checking out Ban's forum thread over on the SWTOR forums over gearing in 4.0. It's a great resource of information. If you have questions, you might be able to get them answered there. There'll be a link to that page in the description below for those interested in seeing that. Now let's get started on the actual gearing discussion. First and foremost, we want to be sure we're using a double-bladed weapon, as well as a force focus, as this provides the most force power and melee damage possible for an assassin, as well as allows us to use all our abilities. The second thing is, since this is PvE, we want to make sure we hit our accuracy cap, and the reason for this is bosses have a 10% native defense resist chance. So by having 110% force and 110% melee accuracy, we won't miss at all, which will increase our DPS significantly. We do this in 2 ways. We get a companion buff, and then we hit 684 accuracy rating. You're probably wondering, what's the companion buff? Well, if you don't know what the companion buffs are, if you go to your legacy pane, under global unlocks, Imperial or Republic classes, you'll notice that if you complete conversation lines with a companion, you get a buff to your stats, whether it's crit, healing received, health, or most importantly, accuracy. The nice thing is, you only have to do this once. So let's say you've completed talking to Scorpio with your agent, or you've completed talking to Scourge with your bounty hunter, then all your characters on your legacy will have a 1% accuracy increase. Even your smuggler will have it now, even though maybe you haven't but just started your smuggler and haven't finished talking with any of these. So I highly recommend getting all your companion buffs, especially the accuracy one, as that's vital to your stats, you'll be able to spec less into accuracy, put more into alacrity and crit, thus increasing your DPS further. So the way we get that second part, the 684 rating, is twofold. You can use my method, which was more common which was the most common method until they came out with proficient stims. But if you're using a versatile stim, which provides mastery and power stat, then you use 2 initiative enhancements, which is the best in slot accuracy enhancement available, as well as 5 accuracy augments. This will put you in 220 or 224 gear, above the 604 accuracy rating, with minimal stat wasted. The reason I use this still is because I PvP, so switching between PvE and PvP, it's a lot easier, not to mention the fact that I was already kind of geared toward this to begin with, and I didn't want to change when they came out with proficient stims. Now, since you're new in your gearing, or maybe you're thinking about changing your gearing that you've already established, the other method is using a proficient stim instead of a mastery stim, so you trade off the mastery and power for accuracy and crit. You still need 2 initiative enhancements, but now instead of 5 augments, you use only 2 augments, and then you can put those other 3 augments into other tertiary stats of your desire. But doing any of those in 220 or 224 gear will give you your accuracy cap. You won't be able to miss against the boss, and that's greatly important. Now, for actual gearing, for the set bonus, we want the Stalker set bonus. That's the one that applies to Assassin and Shadows, and that's what will buff all our different abilities for auto crits or doing more damage or decrease cooldowns. So make sure you get that one. Now, I told you you want 2 accuracy enhancements, the initiative enhancements, regardless of which method you choose, and you get that through 3 slots. You can get it through your hands, your boots, and your offhand. Now, as an assassin, there is an alternative to the offhand. We can use the Sorc Healer offhand called Force Healer, and I highly recommend you do that. This way you don't have 3 accuracy enhancements when getting your gear, you only have 2, and so you're not having to do more min-maxing of your gear. It makes it much easier. So make sure you get the Force Healer offhand while you get the Stalker for everything else. You'll get 1 alacrity piece throughout your gear, and that comes in the headpiece. I have one in my chest piece, which required me to do a little min-maxing. I don't recommend that. If you want to get more alacrity through enhancement slots, then the easiest way is to make sure you get an alacrity earpiece or implants. Now, the way I gear, once I hit my accuracy cap for Assassins and Shadows, whether you're playing Deception Infiltration or Hatred Serenity, so I like to get about 900 alacrity, 1200 critical rating. I personally am doing that through the 2 alacrity enhancements that I mentioned. The 2 accuracy enhancements, then everything else is crit. Then for augmenting, I have the 5 accuracy augments, I have 1 critical augment, and then everything else is alacrity. So you can do what you prefer. I found that this works best for me regardless of the discipline I play. I did some testing with power augments, with mastery augments, with less alacrity and more crit, and I found that in the end this is what worked best for me. What works best for you might be different, so I recommend you test out what you like, but for a baseline, definitely hit your accuracy cap, and then highly recommend around 900 alacrity, 1200 crit, and then kind of adjust it from there. Don't augment for mastery. The amount of crit that you get from mastery at this point is hitting hard diminishing returns. If you're gonna augment that type of stat, go for power instead. However, like I said, I don't recommend it. It doesn't work for me. Might work for you. But that's gearing in a nutshell for both Deception Infiltration and Hatred Serenity Assassins and Shadows. Utility selection for PvE Deception is pretty easy for the most part. You stick to the same utilities for the majority of fights. To start, I like to take Avoidance for the 5-second reduction on force speed cooldown. Oppressing Force is PvP, so we don't bother with it. Shapeless Spirit is very situational. If there's a fight where you'll be taking a lot of damage while stunned, it's worth taking for the survivability and the reduced load on the healers. Obfuscation is good to have in most circumstances. Since you're a melee class, it's better to be in range of the target. It's not always necessary to take, and the speed boost isn't significant. However, it's worth taking if there's nothing else better to take. Lambast is worth taking if you need to do significant amount of lacerating for AoE. However, if there's going to be a significant amount of AoE, you might be better off playing Hatred instead, as it's the superior AoE discipline. Insulation is a must-have for the increased damage reduction. With 224 gear, that 30% armor rating increase equates out to 4.5% kinetic energy damage reduction increase. Electric bindings is very situational and is mostly PvP in nature, so we don't worry about it too much. Snarling slashes is again PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. Disjunction can be nice to have for the increased force speed and force shroud cooldown, or lengths of the cooldowns. Static cling is PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. Fade is a must-have for the reduced cooldown on Blackout and Force Cloak, as those are straight DPS increases. Nerve-wracking is PvP, so we don't bother with it. Immersion is very situational, and for the most part in most fights we don't need it. And even where there is a slow, force speed is usually fast enough to get us to where we need to be quick enough without the need of purging the ability. Sapped Mine is PvP, so we don't bother with it too much. Audacity is another must-have. That extra charge of Recklessness is a straight DPS increase. Speed Surge is very situational. For the most part, you're just better off spending on the cheaper point for Obfuscation, although Speed Surge can be nice to have if there's a lot of fast movement going on. In the Heroic tier, Magnetism's PvP, so we don't bother with it at all. Assassin Shelter is very situational. It's really good for high incoming amount of damage in a short period of time, and multiple amounts of damage, not just one big hit, like Sonic Wall and Sonic Rebounder are better for. Haunted Dreams, again, is situational. It's mostly PvP, and in most circumstances, it's better to have something like a Sork or a Merc do a 60-second stun versus your only 8-second sleep. Dark Stability is, again, situational. It'll prevent from being stunned, but for the most part, there's not too many things where it'll work against or be necessary to use against. Hand of Darkness is PvP, so we don't worry about it at all. Shroud of Madness is nice to have when we stealth out, as it's part of our rotation. It's just increased damage reduction and survivability, and it's an extra cooldown. Gate Manipulation can be decent to have, however, for the most part, it's not necessary. We have enough gap closers as it is that we don't need the extra speed boost when stealthing out. And Phasing Phantasm is again another situational ability. It can be nice to have, however, we have enough purges available to us and other gap closers where we don't need that as our utility selection. For the most part, this is what I choose for Deception, with some minor changes. If I need something like AoE, I might take Obfuscation out and put it into Lambast, or if I need the survivability when stunned, I'll move Obfuscation into Shapeless Spirit. I pretty much always take Shroud of Madness, however, if the damage isn't too bad on myself that I need Shroud when stealthing out, maybe I'll switch it to Assassin Shelter if it's better raid utility. And if I need to in the Heroic tier, then I'll usually take out a Disjunction unless I need the longer Shroud time. I try not to touch these four at all. Next thing to go over for Deception Assassin is the offensive and defensive cooldowns available to us. Our most purest offensive cooldown is Recklessness, that when popped gives us 2 charges of Recklessness, 3 if using the Audacity utility, and while in Deception it will also automatically give us 3 static charges, which the Recklessness charges can be used on our rotational abilities for Ball Lightning and Discharge. It will also proc on the Twin Surge from Ball Lightning for auto crits, as you can see there. And that burned all my Recklessness charges. Another offensive cooldown we have available, but is also a defensive cooldown in a sense, is Overcharged Saber. When popped, it instantly recharges 15% of our health, as well as increases the chance that our lightsaber charges hit and for the damage they do. Also, when they do hit, we get healed for a small portion of health. Next we have our defensive cooldowns. When we're stealthed out, we have Dark Embrace up, which increases our force regeneration significantly, as well as increases our damage reduction by 25%. When we come out of stealth, Dark Embrace will continue to exist for about 6 seconds. Now we can trigger Dark Embrace out of stealth by using Blackout, which gives us that Dark Embrace for 6 seconds again. Another cooldown that we have available to us is Force Cloak, which is a high utility cooldown. We can use it to stealth out in the middle of a fight, so we can revive somebody that's died and save our battle res, or if we've already used our battle res and are on a 5-minute timeout, we can use it then as well. Alternatively, if you're in combat, you can use it to reset your Recklessness cooldown or your Blackout cooldown. If you're using the Shroud of Madness utility, it will also allow you to have Force Shroud time. So I'll go ahead and burn Recklessness real quick and get ourselves into combat. If you notice, I can use this and it immediately puts me out of combat. I have that Shroud time as I noted. It reset the cooldown on my Recklessness. And coming out of stealth, if Blackout is on cooldown, now it's off cooldown, which gives you another Blackout. We also have Pure Force Shroud, where when used, gives us 200% Force Tech resistance for 3 seconds, 5 seconds if you're using the Disjunction utility, as seen here. And then lastly, we have Deflection, that when used gives us 50% melee ranged defense chance for 12 seconds. It's an increase of 50%. The last 3 cooldowns we have are all gap closers. So the most common one that we have is Force Speed, which has a 30-second cooldown unless you're using Avoidance, which gives it a 25-second cooldown, and it increases your speed by 150%. You have Phase Walk, which is off global cooldown, so if I'm spamming Voltaic Slash, I can actually plant Phase Walk while doing my rotation, which is good to know. And then you can use it from upwards of 60 meters away to return to your location. And last, we have Phantom Stride, which can be used in stealth. When you use Phantom Stride, it will immediately move you to the target. It'll increase your speed by 75% for 3 seconds. And if you're playing Deception, it'll give you 3 static charges, allowing you to discharge immediately. And that pretty much covers all the offensive and defensive cooldowns available to Deception Assassin. Before we finally get into an example parse for Deception, I want to briefly go over the rotation. You can pause the video here to read this if you'd like. I'll also include a link in the description so you can download this. The Deception rotation is for the most part simple to follow as it is a priority system. The only real challenge with Deception comes in the form of timing when to use Blackout and Force Cloak on specific bosses, mainly those with downtime, in order to maximize DPS. To get started, we want to make sure we're in Surging Charge stance. For our opener, we always want to start from stealth, and when possible we want to try and precast 2 Lacerates so we can build up 2 stacks of voltage and induction. We will also precast Crushing Darkness if we can get within 10 meters of the boss without risking pulling it. Once we pull, we want to burn Recklessness, and if we don't need it as a defensive cooldown within the first 2 minutes of the fight, we'll also burn Overcharged Saber. This will allow us to use Discharge immediately, followed by we Phantom Stride so we can use Discharge again, and then we follow the rest of the abilities that you see in the opener here. One thing to note is that we try to take advantage of Dark Embrace for 24 seconds in the opener, and we do so by starting from Stealth, which gives us 6 seconds of Dark Embrace, followed by using Blackout for another 6 seconds. We Force Cloak so we can reset the cooldown on Recklessness, as well as when we come out of Force Cloak, reset the cooldown on Blackout for another 6 seconds of Dark Embrace. And then we Blackout finally one last time for another 6 seconds of Dark Embrace, giving us 24 seconds of increased force regeneration, as well as increased damage reduction to the point to where we're practically a tank. And this allows for a high DPS, high burst opener. From there we go into our priority rotation, which consists of using Discharge as soon as we have 3 static charges. We use Ball Lightning when we have 2 stacks of voltage and induction when Ball Lightning comes off cooldown. We'll use Voltaic Slash if voltage is about to fall off. When we're in the execution phase, we'll use Assassinate. Finally, we'll Maul with Duplicity proc. Our fillers are essentially Voltaic Slash and then Saber Strike when we need force. Now outside the rotation, we have to follow a certain set of rules for Deception. We will discharge as soon as we have 3 static charges, no less, and we won't delay its use. The only exception to being able to delay it is if that 3rd static charge was acquired by using a melee attack. If this is the case, we know we won't accidentally build a 4th static charge anytime soon, thus wasting a static charge. And the only reason we'll delay discharge is if Assassinate's about to come off cooldown, or if we need the force so Saber Strike can be used. We want to make sure we can maintain 100% uptime on voltage by using Voltaic Slash. Ball lightning should only be used with 2 stacks of induction, and preferably with 2 stacks of voltage as well. We will only ever maul with duplicity proc, as that decreases the force cost as well as significantly increases the damage it deals. However, do note that maul can be delayed for other abilities and should be for higher priority abilities, since it has a 10-second internal cooldown. Saber Strike is essential to our force management between periods of Dark Embrace, and do know that Ball Lightning having a 6-second cooldown means that there will be 3 GCDs between Ball Lightning. This means that between Ball Lightning, should we not be using Discharge, we will commonly either use 2 Voltaic Slashes or a Voltaic Slash and a Maul, leaving that 3rd GCD to be a Saber Strike to make sure we manage our force well. When we get into the execution phase, which is sub 30% health on the boss, we will be using Assassinate a significant amount of time. It's essential to both DPS and our force management, as force management becomes much easier in the execution phase. Finally, we want to make sure we take advantage of both Blackout and Force Cloak, so we can take advantage of extra time with Dark Embrace for force management and increased uses of Recklessness. For situational attacks, we are a melee class, so we will find time where we're stuck outside of melee range. And when that happens, if we're stuck outside of 4 meters, we want to use our attacks that have 10 meter range. If those are on cooldown, however, our options are, when we're not moving, we can use Force Lightning. And when we do have to move, we can use Low Slash, Force Slow, or Electrocute. Now, if we're stuck out of 10 meters, that's pretty bad for Deception. Our options are to Low Slash, and if we're stuck outside of 10 meters for a long period of time, we can Recklessness plus Force Lightning. Lastly, if we need to AoE a significant amount of time, we're better off playing Hatred instead, as it is the superior AoE discipline for Assassin. However, we can replace Voltaic Slash with Lacerate, as it does proc the same items. If there is more than 3 enemies, then we can just spam Lacerate for increased DPS. However, for the most part, we want to follow on our single target rotation, as that's better for us in the long run. And that's pretty much the Deception Assassin rotation in a nutshell. And now the moment you've all been waiting for, unless you skipped ahead of course, and that's the example Deception Parse. Before I get started, just some quick things to go over. In the bottom left, I'll have a keyboard layout showing the keystrokes I'm pressing. In the top right, I have Star Parse showing my stats for the Parse, as well as Swordcaster showing the abilities I'm using. If you're interested in seeing the Parse from this fight in more detail, there'll be a link to that in the description below. To get started, real quick, I just want to flash my stat sheet again, even though I showed it earlier in the video, just as a refresher of what I have. Now, before we do any parsing, we want to make sure we apply an armor reduction module to the dummy, as well as a health modulator. In most cases, you should use a 1.5 mil health modulator, however I'm going to use a 1 mil for time purposes. So let's get started. Just going to build up our stacks real quick, and then we'll pull from stealth. Dark Embrace falls off, we'll make sure to use Blackout. And here we'll stealth out to reset Recklessness, as well as to use Blackout again. Or Dark Embrace, pardon me. Dark Embrace just fell off, so again, go ahead and use Blackout. I'm going to go ahead and Saber Strike for force management. And Saber Strike again for some more force management. So we're not going to use Force Cloak right away, we're going to wait for Blackout first. Also, we're encroaching on the execution phase, so we'll be wanting to use Assassinate as much as possible. Also want to make sure we keep our stacks of voltage, so be sure to Voltaic/2 as much as we can. Shouldn't have to Saber Strike at all, force management's fairly easy in this phase. And there you have it. That was an example Deception Assassin Parse. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this guide to be helpful. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to put them in the comment section below and I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. Feel free to share this video, and as always, may the Force serve you well.